Well, there's my assembly jig for the diaphragm. Now let's just start with the retainer plate here. It's got the rivet side goes up. Now I've got a new shiny pair of tweezers, very, very pointy. If I haven't stabbed myself 5 times by the time I've got to the end of this camera, I'll be very surprised. My normal tweezers had just got too old and tired. I've been straightened up and filed back that many times that they're just pretty useless. Got to get used to these new tweezers. I'm just using a toothpick there to help me get everything in place. I'll swing that blade over the top. Get all my blades positioned back against the centre of my jig. And I'll put those dangerous pointy ones away and get my other tweezers. And put this in position. This only goes on one way and it goes on there. I know from experience, because the other 4 positions would be wrong. Now I've got to get the case on over the top. This little notch here that rivet fits into. Give that a little wriggle. That's good. Flip it over. Lift the bottom off my jig. Slide it in underneath. And fit the 3 screws. Let's have another go with my dangerous tweezers. Doing those screws up very lightly because I need to make sure that my blades are still seated correctly, that none of the rivets have fallen away from the spots they're supposed to be in, the holes they're supposed to be seated in. That looks good. And it moves freely, so that's good. Means I can do those 3 screws up. And just check the action. Yeah, that moves nice and freely. If there's any stiffness at this point, what I would do is put some graphite powder in here, work it in a bit, and then very, very carefully blow away any loose graphite afterwards, because it would graphite powder would find its way in between the mating surfaces, and it can make a tremendous amount of difference. Where you've got areas like this, where you've got large surface areas of thin sheets of metal running over the top of each other, you can have quite a bit of friction there in some cases. A little bit of graphite powder can make all the difference in the world. But that's fine, that requires nothing. So there's our case, and put that to one side. Turn my attention to the mechanism plate. This is all stripped down as far as you need to strip these things down. This is the detent for the blade actuating ring. Normally you'd leave that in place. It's not easy to get it back on its post. And I just need to make sure I've got this all nice and clean. It looks pretty good, so it shouldn't be much of a fight. Get this mechanism plate back together. It's all clean. I've cleaned this all down with naphtha. It's all looking pretty good to me. Mind you, the mechanism plate looked pretty clean to start off with. So you get no points for having things look exactly as they did before. Get the lens tube in place. It only goes in one way. There's the corners cut off here to clear that bracket, that post there for the bracket. And we might just as well put that one in first. There are 3 screws. The longest screw goes through in that position. If you mix them up, you can have a bad day, so don't mix them up. There's not much in it, probably 1/4 millimetre, something like that. It does make a difference. I'm running these screws down. I haven't tightened anything up. Check that my blade actuating ring moves. That's all good. Flip it over. Make sure I've got none of those 3 screws are sticking out. Means I've got them all in the right way round. Tighten up the 3 screws. Now the blade actuating ring could have been lubricated before I put that together with some molybdenum paste is what I'd normally use, but you can use a tiny smear of graphite grease, something like that. I normally lubricate these things with graphite powder. So I'll just drop some in between the blade actuating ring and the mechanism plate there. And just work the mechanism, the blade actuating ring backwards and forwards. Shake that powder in there, work it backwards and forwards. Knock out any excess, go away and blow all that out. Alright, set this in the blade's open position. Pull that back out of the way, there out of the way. That's the blade's open position. And I can fit the shutter blades back in place. I'll have my shutter blades all clean and ready to go. They didn't require any polishing, they were fine. The shutter has certainly been serviced on at least one occasion before. And now the shutter case can go in place. And he goes on one way. To make sure those holes are all lined up. And there were 3 countersunk screws in there. I'll just run those down lightly. Flip this over, check that the blades close smoothly. That's all good. Do the 3 screws up tight. Check again. Now this is the detent spring here for our blade actuating ring. I'm just going to put a touch of molybdenum paste on there. You could use graphite grease, you could use synthetic grease if you want something on there, otherwise that spring will bind on that post and it won't move smoothly. You'd be surprised how much friction you can get just from one little spring. I'll just put some molybdenum paste on the blade actuating ring where the main cam will strike it, some on that surface there. That should do us, I think. And start the rest of the assembly. Right, to get the springs back in place. Now this spring is particularly good at getting away, so I'm getting it positioned over the post. Then I'll hold a toothpick over the post so the spring can't get away. Use my tweezers to pick up the end of the spring, lift it up, carry it over and hook it behind this post so that lever is now sprung loaded. Now that went unusually smoothly. It might be because I'm using my brand new tweezers, because it doesn't normally go that smoothly. This spring goes over this post. There's a groove in that post that the spring seats into. I'll just pull that back out of the way. I want to set this into the blade's open position so that the B lever will drop down into the normal seated position. The B lever hooks into that spring I've just put in place, then has to seat over that post. There's a little notch in the back of that B lever that picks that spring up, or should do. That spring's dropping away and trying to fall underneath the lever instead of going behind it. And my tweezers are not playing the game today. I think it's because there is a little bit graphite powdered up. Oh, that spring is really keen to get away. Once more. That flash contact is pushing away on my wooden block, so this is not sitting as flat as it should do this time. Okay, that time it went. And the retaining screw for that has a spring on it. The spring acts on the flash sink setting lever. I'm going to get this in position. Of course the spring wants to push the screw away from where I want to get the screw. That spring has to be swung here, has to be swung all the way around over to here. Like that. I've checked that the B lever lifts nicely and returns. That's working well. That screw on the B lever can be snugged up. Okay. The flash sink setting lever can go on there next. That detent there, I want a bit of a wipe of molybdenum paste on there. And here's my lever. There's a ratchet teeth on this at that point. I normally give them a wipe just so that they'll move smoothly. This drops in here. That pin on that has to come up behind that spring. Why is that not dropping in? That's better. Okay, so we had this piece. Now I did my best, I scraped off that rust, I polished that down, I still do not like the look of it. So I have found one in my spares that I can use instead. And so that's what I'll do. You'd probably get away with that one, but why fight when you've got a better answer? And the setting lever is here. Got to get that into position. That's for our aperture setting lever, and there are 3 small screws that hold that down. And the video camera is complaining that the battery's tired, so if I get interrupted before I finish this operation, that'll be why, sorry. Just checking that that moves smoothly. That's very good. I'll nip those 3 screws up. That's good, that's exactly as it should be. Right, I'll change these batteries, we'll get on to the rest of the reassembly. The pallet wheel can go in next, the flash link. Drops in there. There's the sector gear that drives that pallet wheel, and the little hook on the end of this needs to be lubricated with a touch of molybdenum paste or something else so that it latches and unlatches smoothly. Pull this lever back to allow that to drop down into place and hook its spring into position. I'm going to grab this spring with my needle nose pliers and swing it into position. So when that's cocked, release the shutter and the pallets run down. Everything's running smoothly. That looks good. Oh, just stabbed myself with my new tweezers, as I said I probably would. Alright, let's get the rest of this flash sink stuff in place. This lever. The spring on this goes in against the case and it just sort of tucks down into place, and if you couldn't see me do that, that's fine. I can't see me do that either because my finger's in the way. But it just tucks down into there. Here's the flash contact. The moving flash contact sits on top of that piece I've just put in place. Don't get it caught behind the fixed contact over here, otherwise it won't work properly. You won't have a working flash and you won't know why. Get this piece in place. Let's cock this first. Then get this into place. back shortly. Crisis averted. I got the washing in. Right, get that plate in place. And the screws. Plain one at this end. A spring and a shoulder screw at the other end. To make sure that spring doesn't get caught under the shoulder on the screw, it needs to be able to revolve smoothly around the shoulder. Now I've got to hook that spring into place behind here. There's a notch in the back of the arm. That's it. So this is spring loaded. And the shutter release arm can go in there now. I'll just give the shaft to that. It's very light white. Now the spring's inclined to not always seat around the groove on the top of that lever, so watch that. That drops in that way. This has to pick up underneath the B lever. And the spring has to tuck down against the inside of the case. I'm just pushing that down with the tip of a screwdriver. And so that when this swings, it lifts this arm, which allows the main cam to release here. So that looks good. That spring's not tucked down properly. Just going to make sure that's seated around that. No, that's good. Okay. Main drive cam next, and the spring. I'll start with the main cam. I'll get some molybdenum paste. And that curved surface, I want to wipe some on there. That's where it runs against the arm on the retard gear train. Usually give a wipe through the centre, and on the two cam surfaces where it picks up the blade actuating ring. And this should just fit into place. Park that against the stop. And I have the main spring here all ready to go. Gave that a wipe with molybdenum paste and hook that into position. Little hole in the cam, and the end of that spring I've got to pick up and lift over behind that bracket. This is always awkward, and the better the condition the spring's in, the more awkward it becomes. Okay, let's see if I can get that spring in position. It's trying to lift over the top there. Still in camera, only just. Is that seated correctly? Yes, it is. Okay, so this arm here, I was running a bit of molybdenum paste down there so that when that's cocked, we can cock the main drive cam here, and that holds it all in position. Now when you press the shutter release, you'll be pressing on this and it'll release the shutter. Well, that'll work fine, so I'm going to cock that again and put the retard gear train in position, which I have cleaned in naphtha in the ultrasonic cleaner and lubricated with graphite powder. The screw at this end is a pivot screw. Make sure you don't get this arm trapped. It's pulled back by a tab on the blade actuating ring, so you need to make sure that's pulled back. And the screw drops in here. Now this hole that goes through in the retard gear train is oversized, which allows for some adjustment so that you can swing the end in for greater engagement and slower speeds. Right, what do we get? Alright, that was a pretty quick second, so I think we'll need some adjustments there. The self timer, that can drop in. Now there's a screw on the base of that self timer that drops into a hole in the mechanism plate. So you need to wriggle it until that screw head drops in, otherwise this won't seat correctly. That runs down well. Okay, so far so good. This internal ring here, I'm running some molybdenum paste on the inside edge and on the outside edges, including those little rack teeth. And I'll hook this into position over that post there. If it'll go for me. It did, but it immediately lifted off. Let me get that back on there. It's always awkward getting a little spring like that over a post. Okay, that's in place. Let's pull this back so it catches the tab on the self timer. That's sitting there correctly. The pinion that drives the main spring and couples to that thing, I've run some molybdenum paste on the shaft of that where it runs through the body here. Drop that in. That is all sitting as it should. Now I'll put the speed settings cam plate in place. I will have this off again shortly anyway, but just while I'm testing this to get the speeds right. So I'll rub some molybdenum paste over these cam surfaces and through the centre where it runs through the round the lens tube. Get this seated in position. Make sure the B lever is not caught, and I'll put this retaining ring on the front to hold that in position. It's just marginally rough and it's running, that thing. Now I'll just find the right tool to cock this shutter.